Welcome back all, Dr. JC here one more time for Lecture 10. And in reality, this is really a blend of Lectures 10 and 11. We've taken 2 weeks worth of content here and kind of compressed it into one. And in this third part here, we're going to focus specifically on U.S. involvement in World War I. At first, they sat on the sidelines till 1917, and then in April of 1917, they're going to jump into the war, and we'll discuss reasons why, one of which will have to do with Germany's use of submarine warfare, unrestricted submarine warfare. So let's get right into World War I from a U.S. perspective next. As it relates to the United States in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they'd done a good bit of imperialism and expansion themselves. The Spanish-American War helped broker this deal between the Japanese and Russians to end that Russo-Japanese War, and then President Teddy Roosevelt, who was president at the time, had sent that Great White Fleet out to project American power to the world. But it didn't mean necessarily that the United States was an interventionist nation. And so that by the time we get to 1914 and the beginnings of World War I on the continent, President Woodrow Wilson, who was president at the time, tried his level best to steer clear of the rocks and shoals, so to speak. Take a page out of the George Washington playbook, which is stay the hell out of European affairs because you're just going to be in a war. And from a more perhaps practical sense, if Europe's beating the ever-living crap out of each other, they need food and supplies. So why not hire a third shift here in America and just trade with both sides, right? And so for the first couple of years of the war, 1914 and 1915, while Washington did view Europe with a furrowed eyebrow, especially at reports of the casualty counts and the brutality of the fighting, Wilson chose to steer clear of taking one side over the other, whether the Allies or what were known as the Central Powers. Central Powers being Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire. Yet an event's going to take place in May of 1915 that's going to cause Americans to furl a little bit of an eyebrow and start to consider whether or not they ought to be taking a side here, whether or not perhaps they should get involved. And that event had to do with the sinking of a cruise liner, the Lusitania, by a German submarine. You can almost imagine the American reaction, to include that of the Wilson administration, when they read about an ocean liner, this Lusitania, the blue ribbon winner, meaning it's the fastest passenger cruise ship that can move across the Atlantic. This is like a star award or prize they have. That this British ocean liner was sunk by a German submarine. Civilians on board trying to enjoy a cruise. Now, why the hell are you going to cruise into a damn war zone? That's a whole nother different discussion, right? Come on, honey, we got a reduced fare for this cruise. Woohoo, let's go. There's a reason there's a freaking reduced cruise fare. Holy hell. That aside, you can almost imagine the reaction, right? Well, the reaction was pretty bad. Didn't look good for Germany in the eyes of the American people. In fact, German Americans begin to be targeted, not just by their fellow citizens, but by the government. Yes, German Americans targeted during World War I. We make much hay about how Japanese Americans were targeted during World War II, and rightfully so. But German Americans were targeted during World War I as well. For those interested, I ask that you Google that. But the reality for Germans was a simple one. This is warfare. I'm at war with Great Britain. I can't invade their island. They're blockading my ports north of my country in the Baltic. Well, we're going to go ahead and institute our own sort of blockade using submarines. Therefore, Germany, as shown on the slide here, is going to use their U-boats, their undersea boats, their submarines to patrol around the British Islands and basically sink any ships that are coming in and or out of the British Isles that might be carrying war materials. And Germans can turn around and say by 1915, don't hand me this psychobabble, British and allies, about neutral ships, about merchant ships that aren't carrying munitions or weapons of war. Because we know you British have these new ships you call Q ships, where you actually have merchantmen, trader ships that are armed with deck guns. You just hide them. So then when our submarines surface to go ahead to try to get you to stop, you fire on us. So don't sit there and try to tell us Germans that we're playing dirty by shooting you from under the sea unbeknownst to you. You're playing equally as dirty. Unfortunately for the Germans, however, the British are largely controlling the news and message that's getting to the Americas. Yes, we have these transatlantic cables, but somehow magically most all of them get cut, except the main links coming in and out of Britain and the British Isles. So that most of the news that's coming of what's happening in Europe is coming largely from where? Britain. Because they're not going to be biased in one way, shape, or form. They're not going to try to go ahead and influence American public opinion one way or another, right? Returning to the Lusitania, the Germans even took out a half-page ad warning individuals that are on that ship, you're sailing into a war zone. Hello, McFly, you are, and you could possibly be hurt, or worse, killed, because the Germans have suspected what we know to be fact today. Then at the bottom of that cruise ship wasn't just pineapples and papaya fruit. There were hundreds of thousands of rounds of munition on a cruise ship. Because I know all of us today, when we go to set sail on Holland America Line, Carnival, Celebrity, whatever it might be, we expect that those cruise ships are carrying munitions of war so that we could possibly be torpedoed, right? But all of this would not be known to the American people at the time, nor perhaps the Wilson administration, save, of course, the munitions on the ship being sent to Great Britain. So that when this Lusitania sunk south of Ireland, the Germans had good intel and good cause. And modern-day ROVs that can go down to the wreckage site can prove that, and they have. Whether it made good sense by commander of crew of U-20 to sink the Lusitania, I'll leave that up to you to decide. Pretty bad PR. So bad, in fact, that it inflamed Americans and the Wilson administration. And it forced the Wilson administration to issue some pretty stern notices to the German embassy and German empire. More importantly, however, it stirred a discussion between American government officials and business leaders that maybe we need to think about tooling for war. And in 1916, the U.S. Congress passes an Army Appropriation Act, of which part of that act created the CND, or Council for National Defense. Government officials and business leaders will begin to have discussions about coordinating resources in support of any war effort, should it come. That included where specific war items would be manufactured, how quickly they could be manufactured, how they could be transported, so on and so forth. But this discussion will begin in 1916, so that by the time the U.S. is actually engaged in war in April of 1917, much of the logistics, project management would have been worked out. Therefore, by 1916, by the end of 1916, most Americans are favoring the Allies here. And while the Wilson administration is trying really hard to stay out of this, American public support is ready to roll, and they're ready to roll on the side of the Allies. And for as hard as the Wilson administration did try, by the winter of 1917, two events are going to take place that are going to force the Wilson administration to go to war. The first is Germany's return to unrestricted submarine warfare. In an effort to starve the British out, the chief of the German Admiralty, Henning von Holzendorf, convinced the Emperor that we need to go ahead and institute unrestricted submarine warfare. We sink everything, including neutral ships if necessary. We have to starve the British out to win. That will be a reversal of course from 1915, when they backed off after the sinking of the Lusitania and when the Wilson administration issued them the stern notes. The Germans did back off. The second event will be this Zimmerman telegram, and perhaps it's the latter that really pushes Americans and the Wilson administration over the top. After Germany had formally announced in January of 1917 that it was going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, so they did telegraph this to warn the United States especially. A month later, this Zimmerman telegram hits. I want you to think of this Zimmerman telegram in many ways like that Delhomme letter that went about setting off Americans during the Spanish-American War era. This note's going to have the same impact. It was essentially a diplomatic communique sent by the German Foreign Office, known as the AA, or Auswärtiges Amt, and it was directed to the government of Mexico. The idea here was that should the United States declare war on Germany at some point, that the Mexicans and the Germans should ally. The Germans will support Mexican efforts, and if the Americans are defeated, Mexico can reclaim those lands they lost during the Mexican-American War. The telegram was intercepted by British intel, decoded, sent to the United States, winds up in the papers, and you can imagine the outrage. What's interesting here, however, is that Arthur Zimmermann, who was the German Foreign Secretary, in March, he publicly said that, yeah, the communication is real. What you gonna do about it? Well, the Americans will do something about it. And in early April, President Wilson will ask Congress for a declaration of war, for a war resolution. He'll get that. He will sign it on April the 6th, and the United States will officially be at war in World War I. Germany would claim, and I think rightfully so, that the United States had kind of been at war against them, feeding supplies more to the Allies than the Central Powers for quite some time. But it's official on April 6th, and Germany will not get Mexico to bite either. Mexico's going to sit this one out. So German desires to open a two-front war in some sense against the United States are going to fall by the wayside, and they're going to have to deal with American troops. The first troops of America, of which will arrive in June under the command of John J. Pershing, Blackjack Pershing. They will help bolster the French and British lines and help stop that Kaiser Spring offensive, Operation Michael, the Kaiserschlag that was launched by Germany in 1918. And immediately after that, the Americans, as part of the larger Allied famed 100-day push, will look to end the fighting outright during this Meuse-Argonne offensive, part of this 100 days, this Allied counterattack, once the German Kaiserschlag stalls. And while I'd invite all of you to research this a little bit further, I would point out here that this is the largest battle in U.S. military history here. Over 1 million U.S. troops are engaged here. So the largest U.S. military engagement is not in World War II, it's right here in World War I. And to give you a sense of American firepower, at the start of this Meuse-Argonne offensive, in the first 4 hours, more artillery ordnance was fired at the German lines from the Americans alone than was fired in the entire American Civil War. More artillery fire from the U.S. on the Germans in 4 hours than took place in 4 years during the American Civil War. And on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, an armistice is achieved. Not an end of the war, but an end of the firing. And Germany is willing to come to the table now, largely because they've had communication with Woodrow Wilson. And the communication with Woodrow Wilson is that Wilson will push for an easy peace for Germany. That Woodrow Wilson was going to advance his 14-point plan, of which included this League of Nations, an extension of that Congress of Vienna we talked about, and the predecessor of the United Nations today. So Germany says, all right, we'll meet, what do you got to say? And all the individuals then will convene in Versailles. Interestingly enough, the French choose Versailles because it's the very seat of their historical power, and more importantly, the very place where Bismarck declared a German empire to begin at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. The French are interested to see that a German empire be eradicated or ended in the same spot as well. So while Wilson will come to the table with these grandiose plans, these 14 points which some Allied colleagues thought were an ideological pipe dream, Georges Clemenceau depicted here, they referred to him as the tiger, quipped something to the effect that God Almighty gave Moses 10 commandments. From Wilson we get 14. And along with his 14 points, Wilson's going to push for an easier peace. But the French and the British have something entirely different in mind for Germany altogether. They plan to make Germany pay, and pay hard. Whether or not Woodrow Wilson decided to throw Germany under the bus, so to speak, here at Versailles remains subject to some historical discussion and debate. What we do know is that in order for Wilson to get the David Lloyd Georges and Georges Clemenceaus on board to agree to this idea of a League of Nations, he also agreed to allow the British and the French to go ahead and tighten the screws. No, institute a Carthaginian peace on Germany. Not only were Germans forced to sign Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, that said that they alone were responsible for World War I, but they were forced to agree to heavy indemnities. Sidebar, in the early 2000s, Germany had just finished paying off their World War I debt to Great Britain. Truth. Think about that. World War I. And based on that peace, there are some individuals within the German ranks that felt maybe we should have just kept fighting, to include some corporal by the name of Adolf Hitler. So when Germans and the German economy slides into a major contraction, made worse during this Great Depression period, when young Germans see their parents have to suffer, when they have to go without food because they have to pay a war debt back rather than rebuild their own societies, they'll immediately look for someone to rebuild Germany, rebuild hope, and get back at their enemies. And that'll be the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler.